So today we're talking about boundaries and de-escalation. And initially, those may sound like they're unrelated things. Boundaries we normally hear about in the context of, generally relationships, or at least, interaction of like romantic type relationships, or, having good boundaries, or maybe sometimes the context of work, work-life boundaries. Whereas de-escalation normally shows up in contexts like, I'm working security at an event and somebody starts getting angry and yelling and being aggressive. Well, how do I de-escalate that situation? How do I calm them down enough that everyone's safe while we work something out? Well, de-escalation is needed in situations where people are in conflict. In other words, in some form of negotiation, some form of goal-oriented interaction. I want something different than what you want. And boundaries are about establishing where what I want and what you want have to stop when they come into conflict. So boundaries they set bounds around the space of negotiation, which means it's really important to know how to use boundaries and the role that boundaries play in an interaction in order to be able to control how escalated the interaction is. One of the key roles of boundaries is that they allow you to tell if you yourself are de-escalating a situation using effective strategies to calm down yourself and the other people, or whether you're compromising, whether you're giving away something you shouldn't be giving away. If someone is yelling at you and you get them to stop yelling by apologizing when you didn't do anything wrong, you have just compromised yourself rather than de-escalating. Because one aspect of healthy de-escalation is that it doesn't force people to act calmer. It provides the tools and environments people need to communicate without anger and violence and too much stress. So if you know what your boundaries are, for example, I have a boundary against apologizing when I don't know what I've done wrong, or when I don't think I've done something wrong, even if it would make people feel better or act better toward me. That devalues any other apologies I make. And it causes people not to trust me because I'll say, oh, I'm so sorry about anything. And it allows people to take advantage of me by telling me I should apologize, so I think I'm in the wrong. So that particular boundary keeps me from compromising by apologizing to placate people, and instead allows me to de-escalate by giving sincere apologies when I know that I've done something wrong, and asking clearly, please tell me what it is you would like an apology for so that I can give you a sincere apology. And that brings us to another advantage of boundaries in terms of de-escalation, which is they help you figure out whether the other person is negotiating or bullying. If someone is asking you for something, no matter how urgently they're asking for it, if they're respecting your boundaries, then they're interested in negotiating an outcome. They're interested in working it out. And so setting a boundary gives you a big, clear red flag if their interest is to bully or browbeat or cause you to compromise yourself rather than negotiate. Because if you set a boundary and they violate that boundary, they transgress against that boundary, now you know that they're not acting in good faith. They're not there to have a negotiation. I'm going to step aside for just a moment and talk about the meaning of the words negotiate and compromise. Negotiation is about finding a way for everyone to get as much as they can of what they want and need. Ideally, everyone gets all of what they need and as much as they can of what they want. Compromise is about getting people to give up stuff that's important to them so that you get what you want. And it is rarely as effective. Negotiation gives you outcomes that people are okay with, even if they're not the dream outcome that they perfectly wanted. A negotiated outcome is one that everyone is okay with. They can live with that. They're willing to sign up for that. Whereas if someone compromises their consent, they really don't have the energy to go out to dinner tonight, and they say, I don't want to, and you start, explain to them why they're obligated to, and raising your voice when they say no, and they're like, well, I guess we can go out to fast food somewhere. They're not getting what they wanted. They wanted a quiet evening at home. That's a bad outcome. That's a compromised outcome. So we're always looking in an interaction. So in an interaction where there's conflict, we're always looking to negotiate a mutually satisfactory outcome. And one of the ways we do that is with boundaries. Again, going back to the context of relationships, an outcome that violates one of the boundaries of someone in the relationship is not a successful negotiation. That outcome requires that person to compromise their boundaries, which is not a good thing, actually. We establish boundaries for a reason. We establish them because they keep us safe and because they keep other people safe. If I don't put up at least a little bit of a fence, then you don't know where my property ends and your property begins, and you might, plow right, or mow right over my tulip patch. Whereas if we know where the boundary is, then at least you can say, hey, would you like me to mow your lawn, or are you growing something there? Oh, that's where my tulips are. Please don't mow there. Negotiation, not compromise. Not I get some and I take some from what you need. No, we establish what we need. And because we have that boundary, we are both safer. And that brings us to one of the key advantages of boundaries, which is that they are a way for you to reassure the other person that they are not being attacked. If you can get them to set boundaries, or if they give you boundaries and you carefully don't transgress those boundaries, then over time they learn that they can trust you to negotiate in good faith. And I'm going to take a moment to talk about an important lesson from Judaism, actually. Judaism has a concept called the Torah, which is the laws they have to follow. This is where things like kosher come from. And one of the principles of Judaism is, I'm going to put it in their terms, put a wall around the Torah, fence around the Torah. Or in other words, don't press up right against it. Well, I'm not supposed to eat meat and milk together, so I'll take a bite of meat and I'll rinse my mouth with some water before I take a bite of milk, because surely that's okay. Instead, if you're not supposed to have meat and milk together, don't have them at the same meal. Don't even have them in your house at the same time. Stay well back from breaking those laws. Same thing applies to boundaries. If someone says, I'm not comfortable with your hand being closer than 2 feet from my face, you can shake your finger all you want, but don't shake it in my face. And you measure out 2 feet, like, I'm not touching you, I'm not touching you. That is not respecting their boundary. And in fact, it's a great way to make them scared that you're going to violate their boundary and to accidentally violate their boundary. And if you put up a boundary, if you establish a boundary, and the other person starts snuggling up against it as close as they can, that is a big waving red flag with red spotlights shining on it. Because that person is either not caring that the boundary is important to you, or setting you up for, oops, I didn't mean to cross your boundary. I was just, snuggled right up to it and a little misstep. To respect a boundary is to stay far enough back from it that if you make a misstep, you're still on your side of the boundary. That's how you show someone respect. There's a saying, your right to swing your fist ends where my nose begins. You can swing your fist all you want, but if you hit my nose with it, you've violated the boundary of my personal, personal body. Well, actually, your right to swing your fist ends some distance away from where my nose ends. One time, long before we met, my wife was standing in the kitchen with a partner, and he was swinging his coat around and around, and the zipper hit her. And she said, "Please don't swing your coat like that. The zipper on the end of it hits me, it hurts." And he said, "No, I'm not close enough for it to hit you," and kept swinging it. That is not respecting a boundary. It's also, by the way, abusive. But especially, it is not respecting the boundary. It's also not respecting her right to set a boundary. So if you establish a boundary and the other person says it's not relevant, or does their very best to break it without quite technically breaking it, that person is not interested in a negotiation. They're interested in getting you to compromise your boundary and say, well, okay, how about you swing it more slowly, maybe? Or I guess I'll go put a coat on so when it hits me, it doesn't hurt as much. Don't let people push on your boundaries like that, because if they're doing that, they're not negotiating in good faith, and they'll keep doing it. They'll keep doing it more and more until you don't have any boundaries at all. If you want a healthy outcome for a negotiation, boundaries are a great way of keeping yourself safe and of reassuring the other person that they're safe so that you can de-escalate your own emotions. After all, if you have a boundary and they respect it and they stay well back from it, now you know that you're not being bullied, you're being negotiated with, and you can relax. There's a concept from John Gottman's work called flooding, or being flooded. And it describes the state in which your internal emotions have gotten so roiled up that you can't communicate anymore. Your brain shuts down. You can't think clearly. You can't talk clearly. You can't absorb input. You have checked out because your brain is just too flooded with emotion, right? Boundaries help you not get flooded. Boundaries help you go, well, I'm safe. I'm not going to be yelled at, so I don't need to be tensed up in case they yell at me. I'm not going to be yelled at. They respect that boundary of we don't accept yelling in relationships. Don't yell. That's a boundary. And then we can be calmer and more relaxed, and the negotiation can proceed in that de-escalated state. For that matter, having a boundary that says when anyone in the conversation gets flooded, they get to say, I'm flooded. I'm going away now. We'll talk about this later. That boundary helps so much with de-escalating situations. This, by the way, is one of the rules of our household and of our family. Anytime someone is too emotionally upset to engage in a conversation, they get to say, I'm going to leave this conversation now. We'll talk about it again later, and go away. Because that boundary keeps people safe from being over-escalated and makes it possible to negotiate an outcome that works for everyone, rather than getting someone to compromise on what they need or move one of their boundaries in a way that's unhealthy for them. I'm a bit low on time to talk in depth about what is a reasonable boundary, but I'm going to touch on that really quickly before we close. Because a lot of people will a lot of people who are not acting with good intent will misuse the concept of boundaries. They'll say, well, my boundary is that you can't leave the conversation. So if you leave the conversation, you're violating my boundaries. And that's not actually a valid boundary, because it's about controlling the other person relative to the rest of the world, not keeping them away from space that is yours or rights that are yours. There's a whole discourse around rights versus privileges versus etc. that's just become really toxic because it's become politicized. So I'm going to set all that language aside. I'm going to say a healthy boundary is one that protects you from improper actions by others. Walking out of a room is a proper action. So a boundary that says you can't leave the room when I want to yell at you is not a boundary. It's a constraint and an attempt to trap someone in a bad environment. But saying, a reasonable action is be free to move around in the space you're in. And so a boundary you can set reasonably is you're not allowed to push me into a corner. You're not allowed to corner me. You have to give me a way to get to the door that is free from having to push past you. That's a perfectly reasonable boundary. It's saying, I have the right to leave freely. And that boundary keeps both of us safe because it keeps you from pushing into my territory, and it keeps me from getting so emotionally overwhelmed that I can't engage with you anymore. Other healthy boundaries are, we don't accept yelling. What about talking really quietly? Is it an okay boundary to say to someone, you can't mumble or whisper when we're talking because I can't hear you? And the answer is no, that's not a boundary you get to set. It's a request. And a boundary of yours may be, I'm not willing to be in conversations where I can't hear the other person. It stresses me out. So if you end up whispering or mumbling, I'm going to have to leave the conversation. I'm going to leave if you feel the need to do this is a boundary. You're not allowed to do this because I don't like it is not a boundary. It's actually an imposition on the other person, a control on their behavior that is okay. It's okay to mumble. It's okay to whisper. You actually have the right to mumble and whisper. And if someone tries to stop you from doing that with a boundary, that's not a healthy boundary. That's an attempt at control. So when you think about boundaries, think about, is this something that it's okay for someone to do, that they have a right to do? Then don't stop them with a boundary. If you're not okay with them doing that, you can leave, but you don't get to impose on them, don't talk to your friends because it makes me feel scared. Well, no, actually talking to your friends is a normal action. You don't get to stop people from doing that. Boundaries are about keeping yourself and other people safe by protecting space that is rightfully yours, whether that's physical space or emotional space or space of owning your own possessions or whatever else. So think about that when someone says this is a boundary. Is that boundary something they have the right to assert? If not, then that's a problem to work out separately. But you don't have to accept something someone says just because they say, I have a boundary about that. People have boundaries about things that are theirs that they get to protect, not other people's behavior that they get to control. With that caveat, boundaries keep everyone safer in an interaction, which gives everyone more space to relax and breathe deeply and calm down, which leads to positive negotiated outcomes that work for everyone involved. I wish you all good, calm, effective negotiations and outcomes you are happy with. And that's today's talk.